Today, David is going to be talking about the rapid expansion of the number of novels and films set in the near future that are reflecting this growing awareness of climate change and the looming planetary crisis. So in his talk, he's going to explore some of the ways that these fictions can shed light both on the failures of our collective imagination before the challenges of climate change and the possible ways forward in the face of planetary disaster. Now, David's a professor of English literature at the University of Plymouth. He's an author of 2 monographs, including a recent book on the near future in 21st century fiction, 3 poetry collections, and essays in journals, including novel, genre, and 20th century literature. He is co-editor of volumes on Robert Burns and Doris Lessing.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks for the invite. I've got it. Okay. Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks everybody online for being here. So I'm going to talk about the near future today in a sort of vaguely interdisciplinary framing. That's why I've got equations behind me, if I've specially requested them. So the near future. I became interested in this several years ago now, just because an author I particularly like was doing something interesting in science fiction. It suddenly struck me that there's something peculiar about this. Well, if not peculiar or unique, then it reflected something on view in the wider kind of literary cultural realm. So written it up into a monograph that Ben mentioned recently. But the near future, so I'll start by talking about what the near future is, why I think it might have changed and how it's changed recently. And then go through and talk about some of the traits or patterns that I think that the preponderance of the near future in contemporary culture, some of the patterns that it can reveal to us. So what is the near future? Brian Stableford in the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction describes how the near future, or he traces it to the late 19th century and the beginning of future war novels, such as the brilliantly named Battle of Dorking, where in the light of great power conflict, suddenly had this really popular genre where people imagined Europeans invading Britain, and there were kind of realistic novels set a few years in the future where, you know, you're fighting the Russians or the Germans, Dorking or wherever. They actually used to set them in towns where the newspaper circulation was high, so that they can pick it up. And also writers, people like Jules Verne. And the basic argument being the light of rapid technological change, the penny dropping that people could see changes of quite astounding science fictional consequence within their own lifetime. Hence the rooting of that kind of science fictional imagination in the near future. But so the near future, what is it? A definition. I came up with this, but in typical sort of literary cultural fashion, I'll immediately qualify it and say it's really blurry. But fiction set in a world to come that mingle multiple markers of the contemporary with indicators of future difference, so as to suggest a historical continuity with the present moment that has not been utterly ruptured by an eschatological-like event such as apocalyptic disaster or technological paradigm shift. So it's really a way of sort of hedging off, you know, spaceships of Venus or flying to other solar systems. It's not that, but it's also not, strictly speaking, a near future that in a calendar sense, 2032, but after an apocalypse, which also achieves the same kind of drastic rupture. So a sense of continuity with the present as it is. I mean, a sort of classic example would be, you know, open a novel where, thinking of a novel by William Gibson, say, where on the first page he mentions Walmart, and you think, okay, but these new sort of materials that don't actually exist. You think, okay, like now, but the future. But this can be qualified in various ways. So I think actually the post-apocalyptic novels do sort of edge into the near future. And similarly, you see effects of the apocalypse in novels that aren't strictly speaking apocalyptic these days. There's been a sort of passing through the boundaries both ways. And so as soon as I started kind of looking, it's a bit like, you know, this thing doesn't exist, you suddenly start looking for it and then it's everywhere. Suddenly realizing, okay, actually, there's the near future as a setting for fiction has radically increased, I think. And when did it happen? Obviously, there's going to be no single date. It's not like, you know, the calendar clicked over and suddenly the number of near future fictions quadrupled. But let's say 2008 anyway. Partly because some of the novels I'm interested in sort of published around 2007, 8, 9, and then there's more and more obviously from then. And now I go into Waterstones and everybody's at it. I mean, sort of heartening as someone who's written a book about the near future to see it. Sebastian Faulks is doing a near future novel. Louis de Bernier is doing a near future novel. Like everybody's doing a near future novel. But I think 2008, more or less, partly I name it and saying, this is in some ways a useful fiction. But it's important to one of the novels I look at, but it's the year of the financial crash, obviously. And then everything around that, Occupy, Syriza, the Tea Party, the US and its allies in Afghanistan and Iraq, Arab Spring, George Bush in 2004 beginning to kick in, the rise of climate change denial in US politics, but a sense essentially that history can change, politics can change very rapidly in a very short order of time. So again, no definitive, it is 2008, but that sense of Fukuyama's end of history as collapsing, and the financial crash as being one of the major sort of cohering points for that. And indeed, I think you do see more and more novels set in the near future after that, and climate change being the other sort of major obvious reason, as awareness of it incrementally spreads and the pressure of that awareness. So what use might this be, especially in a sort of interdisciplinary context? Well, I think in some ways you can picture it, I like to picture it as sort of, this is a humanities person talking, possibly getting it all completely wrong, but I picture it as what I imagine a radioactive tracer to be in medicine, where you input a kind of something that courses through the bloodstream and it maps unseen patterns and also maps blockages. So, in the musculature, or perhaps better, the sort of artery system of contemporary imagination, if you follow the near future through it, it can sort of reveal otherwise hidden forms or shapes. So that was the idea, really. Take the near future from all these different genres. I mean, some near future novels are science fiction, some are post-apocalyptic, some are concerned with tech, some are concerned with the environment, some are concerned with revolution, all these different genres that otherwise would be kept apart, but saying, okay, if you take the near future and allow that to group them together, what patterns might you start to see that transcend the more customary ways of dividing these novels from each other? And so genre becomes really important. So thinking of genre as, okay, you can think about it in a way a bit like, genres are categories. So I put my socks in my sock drawer, my t-shirts in my t-shirt drawer, my trousers in the corner of the room, and I put my sci-fi on the sci-fi shelf, my crime on the crime shelf, and the other stuff on the literary shelf. I mean, that's the commercial way of thinking about it, but the more sort of theoretically informed way for decades now in English literature and cultural studies has been to think of genre more of a spectrum. And so novels will draw on different genres, but more to the point, genres are bound up in a sort of dialectical, dynamic relationship with the historical period in which they come to prominence and develop and change and fade. So Michael McKeon, in his kind of brilliantly comprehensive book, The Oranges of the English Novel, puts it well, I think. Genres provide a conceptual framework for the mediation, if not the solution, of intractable problems, a method for rendering such problems intelligible. Genres fill a need for which no adequate alternative method exists. And when they change, it is as part of a change, both in the need they exist to fill and in the means that exist for its fulfillment. So this idea of genre as being sort of, in a way, produced by and in response to the culture as a way of mediating, thinking through, processing, telling stories about the culture that it comes from. Hayden White puts it slightly differently. I won't read the whole thing, but how in history historical periods are obviously these artificial things, a bit like saying 2008, the near future starts, but equally you can't do history without periodizing. And on this view, historical reality too has its genres, within which literary practices are inevitably turned to the cultivation of those genres, best suited to represent what is unique of their epochs. So the thinking that was driving me was, if the near future is this sort of newly preponderant thing, this newly pervasive manifestation that cuts across contemporary genres as we know them? Could it actually be a new genre? What happens if you think of it experimentally as a new genre that's coming into existence in response to the sort of unprecedented historical situation we find ourselves in, most notably with climate change? And in that sense, it's sort of treading out into empty air, into the future, and leaving behind established genre categories. And then I found Raymond Williams' ideas really, really useful as a background to this as well. So Williams thinking about culture at any one moment as made up of three parts. So you've got the dominant culture, which is what it sounds like. So for us, it would be sort of 21st century capitalism. In part of residual and archaic forms. So a good example would be something like the royal family. You know, they're there as a presence in our culture, but obviously they're not dominant anymore. They're just a sort of carryover. But then sort of interesting part for the project of thinking about the near future is of emergent culture, which Williams says is substantially alternative or oppositional to the dominant. Never only a matter of immediate practice, it depends crucially on finding new forms or adaptations of form. So obviously that sounds very like that description of genre I just spoke to. So this idea of, you know, reading the rooms in a way out of the fiction that's being produced now, so kind of sense, is there some new genre which wouldn't just be a literary or cultural thing, but would be a form of practice in a political sense or cultural sense, some new cultural form. And it ties in with his kind of very suggestive term, structures of feeling. So a new genre being like a new structure of feeling, which Williams later called a deliberately contradictory phase. But he says it's a structure in the sense that you could perceive it operating in one work after another, which weren't otherwise connected. People weren't learning it from each other, which is a bit like the way I take in the book lots of different novels that otherwise would not be connected, but are because I've connected them, because I see them as manifesting the same structure. Yet it was one of feeling much more than a thought, a pattern of impulses, restraints, terms. So that was the goal, really, to kind of think, okay, so let's say there's this emergent genre, which is not just literary, but would be a culture, emergent culture of the near future. Like, what does the fiction currently being produced suggest that might look like, and what can that tell us about where we are now, about how we think about climate change, how we respond to it, the stories we tell ourselves about it. And so I thought that, or I sort of describe, sort of experimentally really, or provocatively, that it falls into two genres actually. And so one genre as being quite a genre of retreat. So it attempts to negate or escape or deny climate change. But interestingly, in works that are often ostensibly really quite progressive, their authors are clearly believe in climate change. They're trying to address it. They want to tell a positive story about it, positive in the sense of, you know, this is a major thing. This is the thing of our lifetimes. I have to tell a story. I have to write a novel, make a film that responds to this. But because they are working in those residual or dominant genres, my argument is they end up telling stories that are actually antipathetic to the situation we find ourselves in, actually positively unhelpful, but often in a diagnostic way. So they reveal those blockages I spoke about. And I'll speak to those in a minute. I'll speak about them now. So various trends or themes I found in this first genre, this genre of retreat. So one is escape to the country, as the amazing BBC series would have it. Very old trope, sort of pastoral trope, but amazing that people are still writing in a way, but it still gets written. The idea that you can retreat to somewhere in the countryside, often in a nuclear family or some form of family, or a couple with children or grandparents, something like that, something quite Western, modern, bourgeois form of family, and see it out. And that is the response. You see that again and again. Paired with that is often what I think is often a quite unconscious hatred of cities. Like cities get it in the neck quite often in these fictions. And I don't think it's just a sort of pseudo-realistic, oh, well, they're in trouble when infrastructures break down. There's a sort of relish, which goes back to, you could trace that all the way back to Revelation in the Bible, but a relish in destroying places like New York. And another theme I saw you see again and again is a valorization, a celebration of creativity, of art, which in some ways is obvious. Art is a meaningful form of work in a society of bullshit jobs. Art as fulfilling, art as independent, but actually it often falls back on this quite romantic idea of the isolated artist producing their work. So maybe, a photographer retreating to upstate, wherever, with their family as society breaks down with a pandemic, and they're a photographer and they lose themselves in photography and their children. That's actually describing Arcadia, a novel. So those kind of themes coming up again and again. So to give an example of the kinds of ways I tease this out, I think one of the less obvious things, but I think it's a sort of subset manifestation out of cities, is that in these works, again, by sort of impeccably liberal, progressive authors, really, as far as you can tell from interviews, as far as you can tell from what they seem to be trying to write, I think you can often pick up actually a kind of fear and hatred of the mass, the mob, which is often either coded as foreign or probably more often as white working class. In America, biker gangs. In Britain, sort of Brexit racists. But, and the novel, actually, the enemy in the novel is not so much petroculture, or not even the tsunami or whatever, which is more like a sublime backdrop. The thing that's feared and disliked is often that just on the margins, but the idea of these others, these massive people. And obviously the city, then, it's quite suggestive, a site of a mass of people, multiplicity, a site of politics as well, of mass politics. And so something about this retreat to the country, to art from the city, as also being a retreat from politics. So in Gold Fame Citrus, for example, a novel set in a near future California, in which it's being rapidly desertified in quite a dramatic way. Dunes are sort of overtaking the country. It's vaguely authoritarian, sort of slightly familiar dystopian setting. So just tracing it in the barest of bones way, but to show what I mean about this idea of the collective, of gatherings of people as being sort of setting off an allergic reaction in these novels. It starts with this couple who are quite damaged, but they are in a sort of vaguely pastoral retreat, sort of out of time. I mean, the timelessness of it is stressed. They're sort of, making love, and, they're damaged, both of them, but they're out of time. And then they go to this market where they have a child sort of foisted on them, or they take it up a gang, who are, are bad. They're kind of violent, they're not looking after the child, sort of they're kind of clearly coded as sort of underclass or drug ravaged, sickle-thin teenager, so on, so on. But the child forces them into time. If you look at it just as the mechanics of the novel, there is no plot, there is no time, there's no history until she encounters this group of people, like a group larger than a family. That kind of kicks the novel off, and she runs through them with the child and their various adventures and escapades until they come across a desert cult. So another form of a group who take the child from them, and the novel sort of, as if it's lost its heartbeat or its engine, just can't go on, ends. Like she commits suicide effectively, the heroine. But the idea that an underclass gang and a desert cult, I'm not holding these up as positive responses to the situation we find ourselves in, but they're like a sort of nightmare version of what we might actually need, which is a collective, a politics, a group of people who are sort of engaged in some larger project. So they're sort of a dystopian manifestation from which I think you can sort of excavate or read utopian potential, which the novel lacks. And it's a kind of, I think the novel's sort of aware of that at some level. It's sort of is troubled by its own existence in a way. Or to take another example, Her, I thought of trying to actually play video clips, but then I thought that was just going to be a technological nightmare. So you're stuck with stills from Her, directed by Spike Jonze, starring Joaquin Phoenix. In some ways, it points up this idea of patterns that transcend apparent subject matter. It's a novel that's set in the near future. If you haven't seen it, it's concerned with AI, a sort of sentient seeming operating system that he falls in love with. There's no apparent concern with climate change in the slightest, or dystopia. But at the same time, it bears exactly the same sort of, I would say, incipient DNA, imaginative DNA as these other works. And so partly the novel seems to be about love and loving an operating system and wanting authentic love. But I think it's actually what it loves, what it wants is a safe, nice bourgeois existence with gardens and sunlight and nature away from cities. So you see that at the very start where it opens and he's in this sort of grim office. You can't really see it in the two stills, except to note on the left, it's got these sort of prison bar blinds. That's before he meets the sort of operating system. And the next is there isn't. And if you see it actually sort of on the screen, there's tinkling piano music in the slide on the left now. And on the right, it's much dingier and dirtier. So there's like a poetics of sunshine and the outdoors and of nature attached to all the positive stuff in the novel. And the most sort of celebrated, the most positive scenes in the novel are of him remembering scenes in basically in private property, in gardens like this, in parks, in flats. So again, that sort of idea of retreat to basically a bourgeois model of what a desirable life is with a partner who he's lost in the film. So it's his memory. Conversely, and you see it again, like a picnic on the cliffs in California. I think it's filmed in California. The most negative scenes are filmed in cities, sort of vaguely smog-filled. And they're also, I think, detectable as, I think it's Shanghai. So you can't actually recognize it as Shanghai, but I think it seems to me, I'd say, recognizable as a sort of Eastern metropolis. And even if it isn't, the fact it's a city and it's gloomy. So there's, again, that basic underlying pattern of pastoral versus the urban. And then the most negative scene, thinking about that coding as well of the mass, the other, he's surrounded by an exclusively Asian background cast of passers-by, which is kind of astonishing, really. And I'm sure they didn't notice. It's just the fact they were filming it in Shanghai, probably. But there's something about this idea of the mass, of the city, of the sight of crowds and crowds of people. And this kind of fiction has been basically sort of allergic to that and everything that's bound up with that. So you think of the idea of the polis, politics, which involves inherently a city, a mass of people. And so it's a flight from the site of politics, this genre. And it ends with him sort of pairing up with a friend, so back into this sort of bourgeois coupledom, watching the sun rise. I think rise, not set. So just as thinking now briefly about some examples of novels doing something different. Well, Kim Stanley Robinson, I think, is a very good example of someone trying to write a different kind of novel and sort of actually acutely aware of the kinds of things I've been saying, I think. So I'll go run through this one very briefly, but that idea of the artist and of art. So he wrote a novel called Red Moon about a sort of revolution in China. I think it was 2015, no? Right. Recent. In which one of the characters, Ta Shu, is an artist, a video blogger, traveler, poet, practitioner of Feng Shui. But he's also an artist that's not really producing any art anymore. But he applies sort of art and aesthetic method to society and to history. So Feng Shui becomes a kind of Taoist political geography. It's about seeing the pattern. It's practical. The desire to periodize history is a desire to do a kind of feng shui on time itself. He performs political feng shui at one point. So it takes that idea of the artwork, of being an artist, and I think democratizes it. So the work of art becomes not a work of art, but the novel itself, or the revolution, or history. And it's a work of art that everybody in the novel is engaged in making together. So it sort of recodes history as art and art as history, and says, you know, that to be an artist now, essentially, is to join in this great collective creative project that is radical systemic change. And it doesn't matter what you're doing, but if you're doing that, then you are being sort of authentically creative. And he realizes that has to be paired with praxis as well, with acting. And so at some point later, he says the time has come when we have to act. So act. And his journey is paralleled by an AI in the novel who ends up with almost the same kind of conclusion, having performed almost the same kind of pattern-seeking operations on what's happening in the novel. So they're reading, the pair of them, both characters, are reading history as you would read a work of art in order to work out what needs to happen next. And then once they've worked it out, it's not like you don't then retreat to your cottage in the countryside. You act, you do something. So it's participatory. So getting away from that more romantic idea of what it is to be an artist and an artist. But I'll speak a little longer, but not much longer, to New York 2140. A novel set in New York in 2140, in which Manhattan has largely flooded, and is so sort of half based on extreme projections about what will actually happen if, you know, certain parts of Antarctica melt into fall into the sea and so on, and partly with sort of extravagant near future science fictional touches. But I think the novel, one of the ways the novel is interesting is suggesting another genre of the near future, which I call, do I call this? The genre of revolution, or genre of the emergent near future. And revolution not meaning, you know, blood on the streets and guns necessarily, but just meaning radical systemic change. So, you know, if we have a revolution, you would want it to be something that was not like barricades in the street and people being rounded up and shot. But, you know, how do you achieve radical systemic change? And Robinson's models, actually, he looks to things like velvet revolutions in Eastern Europe, and a book by Elizabeth Chenoweth called Why Civil Resistance Works, where she sort of looks at data from different kinds of revolutionary action and finds that civil resistance actually can achieve radical systemic change. And so he kind of borrows lots from that characters mentioned and mentioned the work. I'm going to kind of slightly ambitiously maybe, I'm going to draw on something called the Grimes square, or the semiotic square. So just bear with me, stay with me. So there's a guy called A.J. Grimes, who was a semiotician, the study of science. It was picked up by Frederick Jameson. But it's basically a way of arranging qualities or themes together to get beyond the sort of oppositional analysis. So looking not just at male or female, but making that a fourfold analysis. So you find the not feminine, the not masculine properties, and you arrange them in a vaguely sort of Kabbalistic or occult way in this square to produce other qualities that you might not have discerned or thought of otherwise. So it's a sort of creative exercise that has a sort of protocol. Think of it that way. And so starting with some of the characters in New York 2140 and how that novel sort of responds well to that arrangement, to divine things you might otherwise have seen. So there's 4 characters in the novel who trigger the revolution. So there is a revolution. There's a sort of national strike. They bring down the banks in order to nationalize them. There's a sort of bottom-up movement that achieves radical systemic change in 2140. And the 4 characters who are in on that are the citizen, who's this sort of anonymous, sarcastic New Yorker voice who contextualizes what's happening in history for us. You know, he fills in the context. There's Charlotte, sort of community organizer, local politics. There's Franklin, who's a sort of macho, ultra masculine hedge fund manager. and Amelia, who is a social media star who flies around the world in her blimp or Zeppelin, making nature programs. They're the four people who are sort of in on the plot, in on the revolution. And it's Amelia who triggers it at the end by broadcasting to her 600 million followers, who are sort of cued to this by this stage, saying, so you better help me. But in terms of rearranging the major qualities at work in our culture, I think New York 2140 does something similar that can be brought out by arranging them into one of those Grimus squares. So if you think of the citizen, basically as history, as orthodox history, masculine history, top-down, overviewing, anonymous, that form of organization of society. And you think of Charlotte as the sort of counterpart of that. It's a local organization, tribal, communal, in-person, embodied. There's a male and female element there as well, obviously. But those two ways of organizing. And then Franklin, as you know, he's a hedge fund manager, he wants money, he's competitive, as basically the practical intellect, competitive intellect. And again, it's quite gendered, you know, that's often gendered as male. But he being sort of the counterpart of the citizen, there's sort of two sort of male poles, you know, like intellect, competition, money, and supra-tribal organization, national history, top down. And the counterpart to Charlotte's sort of embodied politics, embodied organization, being Amelia's, she's incredibly empathetic as a character, very emotional, very appealing. So she's the sort of empathetic. So she's the counterpart to that. And obviously her and Franklin are then a sort of pair as well. But Robertson then scrambles this in all kinds of interesting ways, in that you'd sort of expect Amelia and Franklin then to pair up. But Franklin actually gets together romantically with Charlotte. And Amelia, and they sort of switch places. And so by the end, Franklin, who's linked to the sort of global history, so Robertson reverses the valence on his sign. He sort of reverses the realm in which he manifests, in that Franklin becomes deeply embodied and local. So he takes that competitive intellect, he's a hedge fund manager, and he puts it into designing and selling innovative sort of housing at a local level. Whereas Amelia, who's the most sort of local and embodied and empathetic, takes that sort of empathetic engagement with nature and it becomes global, sort of completely paradoxically, through the fact she travels over the world, through the fact she has this international audience. And so in a way, I think the novel is saying, or Robertson is saying, like, you need to take what currently is a global intellectual framework of banks and money and the economic competition and sort of make that local. And you need to take what currently is local, like an attachment to place, to nature, to ecology, and make that global or planetary. So they sort of swap positions in that sense. And hence Amelia, in that completely sort of paradoxical, you know, she's local, but she's global position, is the key. She's the one who launches the revolution, like literally says the words and triggers it with the support of the others. And then there's other characters who you can sort of join into that as well, like subsidiary characters. So, you know, you connect history with embodiment and empathy, and you get the police as a sort of necessary infrastructure. Or you could connect tribal and community organization with that intellect, and you get infrastructure. So engineers, quants, data analysts, who are sort of important to the novel. And I'd say another thing Robertson does really interestingly is infrastructure becomes really visible in his imagination, as opposed to being a backdrop that's basically there to be destroyed or becomes titillating when it's breaking down. He's actually interested in infrastructure and characters who build and maintain infrastructure, like physical infrastructure, electricity, buildings, materials, transport. And then I'd say, like, the sort of utopian position that's produced is these two orphan boys and a local historian who sort of combine the intellect with that empathetic play, and that sort of unneighborable utopia of the future. And I'll leave it there. Yes, I put a lot out there, but I hope it was interesting and stimulating. But I think that idea of, no short order, but basically, like, if it's not a genre, if it's not a narrative of revolution at this stage, if it's not a narrative of radical systemic change, then you're stuck in old genres that are going to fail. And that's true of cultural forms, of the way we organize ourselves as a society, as much as it's true of fiction that attempts to deal with climate change in any vaguely sort of realist or responsive way. So thanks.
Thanks so much, David. Really stimulating, fascinating talk. We've got about 15, 20 minutes for questions now. So I can open this up to the floor. And Regina, if you've got an eye on the chat in case there's anyone who's got questions or people want to raise their hands on Zoom, come in.
What do you think about the history of this kind of radical revolutionary stuff? So back in the 1930s, when poets in New York, George Orwell, giving up writing and also become activists, declaring the solitary artist, bourgeois artist to be finished, it all has to be collective action. Yet at the same time, you got all these Bloomsbury, the novel that came out of that time seems to be still with us and really studied and valued. So maybe sometimes it's really difficult for people to read and absorb the disruptive practices of revolutionary experiment. I mean, maybe this is an obvious question, that it then becomes very niche and unread. Not in the examples that you've given, but how do you see that negotiation going on between successful novels that satisfy and reach people and do move them, and experimental forms that disrupt and are really challenging but maybe turn people off? Something like that.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting idea. Just sort of an oblique point before I address your main point. It's kind of interesting that some of the novels I look at, which are set in the near future, and which I argue are sort of slightly retrogressive, they're doing this whole retreat thing, but they're nevertheless sort of deeply informed by modernist values. They're sort of advertising themselves as being sort of post-Woolfian for the cultural cachet. So it's like what was once radical is now commodified, right? Whereas what is, sci-fi is, I think, more of a valued form now. It's not just seen as pulp, but nevertheless not seen as something as radical. But I think maybe it's the difference there, genre or mode in the sense of poetry and prose, and maybe also that sense of practice as an artist, in that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer to. I don't have any answers, but there might be someone who's producing a narrative like Robinson that is read by lots of people, it's taken up very widely, or people doing more experimental work, but would the value there be in its collectivity, in the way you do it, as opposed to the idea that it's going to reach 100,000 people and change how they think about the world? I don't know, but the idea of changing the way we think about what it is to be creative, what it is to produce work. And I know you've done this kind of thing yourself, like working with other artists, working with people who aren't artists, but the idea, in the same way that the revolution becomes the work of art, the idea of the work of art as being something produced by a community of people, in a way modeling what it is to be a community that's not based on extraction, consumption.
Great.
There you go. That's
great.
Corinna.
This might be sort of out there sort of question, but and I don't exactly know what I'm asking. But you mentioned several times patterns, and you talked about you yourself looking for patterns in these genres, but also within them there is a search for patterns. And now I work in a totally different kind of genre, which is photo books, for one thing, and I've just been writing about how right now everybody's looking for patterns. And in fact, I've just been reading this lovely little book by a guy who's a historian of, he's an American historian, but he's talking about, I'm doing a photo book because I picked up a camera, and I'm not a photographer, because I need to identify patterns. So I'm taking pictures of, buildings that are up release. And so I'm understanding what happened post 2008.
Yeah.
So I don't know what I'm really asking, except can you say something more about this search for patterns? It seems to be that this is a sign of the times.
Yeah. Wow. I don't know. There's lots to think about there. I mean, this, I don't know, is as those of us who are literary critics, is that what that it is to be a literary critic, you know, in a disciplinary sense? But I get what you're saying about the wider search for societal patterns. I don't know, off the top of my head, I mean, the patterns I mentioned in the novel, I think it's telling that the pattern seeking is within what I see as the most sort of interesting novel, where people are consciously trying to respond to a moment of historical impasse. And so one thing, say, New York 2140 does is it's not just looking for patterns in the present day, but sort of reconstructing a narrative out of history that tells a different story than the one that just predicts apocalypse, because humans are just like this. You know? So it sort of collages or revives like different bits of history and pieces together to say, look, human history is full of revolutions, effectively. People are always doing amazing things. And if you follow that narrative out, then where are the patterns now? So it's pattern seeking back through time, as well as, say, looking at Tillett science or whatever. But I think it's also partly the nature of it being a novel. So I haven't thought about it so much as in, you know, someone actually in the world, because a novel is obviously a narrative or a poem. It's a pattern thing. So there's something usefully reflexive about a novel sort of reading itself in a way to find, I mean, suggestive that like plot is what a story is, but also what a revolution might be, you know, like what do you do? What happens? And so a novel that is kind of about finding a plot in both those senses. So patterns is going to be part of it.
I think that's exactly what I'm sort of identifying in this other genre. And in fact, a couple of photographers have said that kind of thing, like that we are at a historical impasse and we've not paid attention to stuff in history, or we've not seen it, or we have to find different ways of reading it to understand what we should do. And so there's a kind of return in some of them to places and of the past, and saying, what does it look like now?
I think there's, like, I didn't talk about it here, but drawing on utopian studies and utopian theory, but the idea of the pattern you discern, the future you see and create will not be, you know, it is not going to be the one that happens, but the very creation of it creates the energy or the space in which something can appear. So there's a sort of built-in failure to this act of imagination, but if you can't imagine it, Frederick James talks about how our imaginative, I think this is muscles have atrophied, like we have somehow lost that musculature where you can really imagine a different world than the one we live in, like a different world of capitalism. And so, like, how do you revive that? You know, what sort of remedial physical, what physio do you do on your imagination to be able to read out a different pattern that you might then, something else might come and fill.
Got a question on the chat here. Izzy, did you want to unmute and ask your question, or I can read it out otherwise? Maybe I'll just read it out. So in order for a genre novel work to be considered emergent, do you think it has to possess an optimism that climate change is a fight the collective can win? Or is there a way in which an emergent work can hold its hands up and perform collective grief and still engage in an emergent form?
That's a great question. I sort of loathe instinctively and sort of on principle and in practice, kind of, I don't want to be the one who's drawing lines, you know. Well, I wrote a book on the near future fiction, and I hereby draw a line that says, you know, one is valid, one is not. One is part of my emergent form, one isn't. So I guess my most authentic response would be, you know, I'd be interested to hear what anyone who thought out that question thought themselves. In the idea that, you know, it's not like I'm positing something that actually exists in a sense, it's more of a sort of experiment or heuristic. So, you know, that would be my answer. Having said that, my instinctive take on it would be that I think Kim Stanley Robinson has said at some point, you know, he's a big influence on my work. He's a really powerful thinker as well as a great writer, that, you know, we've had enough apocalypses, basically. We've sort of done that, and dystopias. You know, they serve their purpose, but we've had enough of them, like literally we sort of overdosed on them. We have too many. We need utopias now. And my instinct is to sort of sympathize with that viewpoint. I mean, I wouldn't want to rule out, you know, again, not drawing lines or creating diktats where you know, collective grief is thereby invalid in a novel, say. But my sense is what we lack as a culture is that sense of, I mean, optimism is maybe sounds too naive. Hope might be a better term, but you know, if we don't have hope, then if we don't believe that we can do something, and at this stage we all know it's bad. We all know it's right, seriously bad, and that, you know, the best case scenario is still pretty disastrous. But what's the alternative but to think that there is still something better than something worse, and having in that sense hope. But yeah, that's a great question.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. It's great. I'd like to ask a question about or focus the attention on language. And I'd like to ask you if in all your readings in this near future fiction, you've sensed a change in language. And I don't mean necessarily radical change in the use of language, but I'm thinking of Ishiguro's book called Clara, where there's, for me when I read it, there was a real change in tone or what his writing settled upon or touched, and the way that his writing moved from one sentence to another. And I found it very unusual.
Yeah.
So I was thinking to myself, well, of course, it's a genre that you might think is not revolutionary, but it seemed to me to be quite unusual and rather disturbing and totally in tune with what he was trying to write about in that book.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can comment on that.
Yeah, language. I don't think I did. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention enough or paying attention to that, but I didn't see a correlation between the way writers using language and their inhabiting of this temporal or generic zone or whatever it is. I mean, and with someone like Ishiguro, I mean, the way I picked up on language, I think it's still, for me, reading it more as part of a writer's universe or way of being. Like a writer has the way they use language. So like Ishiguro, like Clara and the Sun, but you know, The Buried Giant, which is set in this incredible pseudo Anglo-Saxon England, as being sort of equally strange, equally Ishigurian, if that's a word, in its use of language. So the use of language is for me being more correlated to actually how writers write, regardless of what they're writing, than altering under the pressure of being a near future novel. I mean, there are certain things that come up again and again, as you'd expect. You know, there's a dramatic tropes, whether it be pandemics or flooding or AI, you see again and again for obvious reasons in terms of the matter that repeats through these different genres. But well, you could read in languages doing interesting things in a particular novel. I didn't get the sense that the fact it was in the near future had prompted it to do that.
Okay, this might meander. I'm a first-year master's student with the Global Sustainabilities Programme attached to the Global Systems Institute. I also did a master's in creative writing here, so I'm really excited to be here. the fascinating thing about systems thinking is they have lots of aspects with like positive feedback and negative feedback, and it's almost as though we're given this sort of storytelling machine to deal with real life effects. So we're effectively anticipating hazards and then attempting to see where the leverage points are, where you can basically improve the situation. So we're basically storytelling and then also trying to rewrite that story. And obviously for one of my exercises, I've been looking at climate-induced migration patterns in like developing countries which have low adaptive capacities. So obviously, the more intense the climate change, the more their livelihoods are disrupted, the more they're pushed into urban centres. But because they're poor urban centres, then the infrastructure stress is quite strong. So you might have amplifications of that leading to violence perhaps, and then pushing over to our borders. And obviously policymakers here have a bit of a fear about that hurricane, which Suella mentioned. So you have that securitization of the migration system, more fences, more borders, more checkpoints here. So I found it really interesting that that's where that thinking got to. So in terms of the fact of like Brian Boyd with the Origin of Stories book, we have this evolutionary aspect of humans being storytelling creatures. So, I mean, you're obviously going to recognize that the stories are a really important aspect of trying to get humans to be galvanized into action. So what you said that revolutionary story is going to be more powerful in your eyes compared to ones that maybe paint a more concerning picture in a sense. It's similar to what your question was in terms of like stories that hit the heart but or also maybe turn off because they might be a bit disturbing. So is it a case of something that looks like what the risk could be that create a sense of unease that might be quite galvanizing, or again it's a revolutionary thing? And also, have you read Deluge, or is it a brand new book? The FT recommended it yesterday, like near fiction about climate breakdown.
Fiction. Confession of a near future picture person. Sick of them. I haven't read one for about a year. Take your break.
Historical romance or nothing.
That's a great question. I think it is different from futurology, you know, that kind of that tradition, but well, firstly, I mean, I've no idea what's needed. You know, I think it's a case in a way of all hands to the pump and everybody telling the story they need to tell and hoping that enough of them stick in the right way. I think it would be foolish to kind of order in a particular quotient of novels on this subject and decree that the others aren't going to be useful. Who knows? Though I do think my sense of it is that, as I said, we've had enough dystopias, enough of a sense that, you know, it's all going to go wrong. So novels that produce that hope, that sense of space, are kind of, or films or narratives are what we lack, and ways of telling them. I think there's something interesting there about the difference between systems thinking and those kind of predictive stories, if we call them that, or forms is maybe a better word. I mean, Ben and I have kind of written on this a bit together and thought about this, and other people thinking along similar lines. But you know, a novel or a film, say, as you'll know, as a creative writer, you know, generally has a protagonist of some kind. You know, there's characters, there's individuals, but obviously with climate change or system, any kind of system, there's the problem of scale. Like, how do you tell a story with characters that people can invest in, that nevertheless can encompass the movements and actions of millions of people and of planetary systems, perhaps over scales of time that are completely inhuman? And so, I don't know, I think it's an open question how that happens, but I think it is something different. A fiction is something different in that sense from the kind of modeling which has a narrative but is more applied or empirical, and is aiming to sort of model what might happen, detect feedback loops, kind of nuance in that way. And I think, I mean, one thing I didn't get to, but in terms of genre, one of the interesting things about Robertson's recent work is that it's a revivification of the historical novel, I think, but the historical novel moved into the future. And so, especially in Marxist criticism and history, you know, the historical novel as being the great novel of radical systemic change, you know, starts with Walter Scott and Waverley. Like, how does a feudal system become a capitalist system? That's Waverley. So how the historical novel as being a sort of template for telling a story about national scale, in this case, or wider, I guess, European scale systemic change and movements and changes of ideas. And I think Robinson's been trying, obviously clearly really interested in the historical novel, but something slightly kind of interesting or telling that it's now been booted into the future. And so, but there are anyway very strong generic links between the historical novel and science fiction. But yeah, no answer, but some context.
On the chat from Alex. Are you familiar with the shared socioeconomic pathways? And if so, how do you feel about them? If not, maybe other future scenarios that have been developed. Do they disappoint you / inspire you?
This is where I need Alex to be here in person, because I'm not familiar with the shared socioeconomic pathways, I think. And future scenarios that have been developed.
Oh, Alex, and if you're able to, will we be able to hear Alex through the speakers?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, so the shared socioeconomic pathways, I work on different land use modeling scenarios at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, and one of the cornerstones of the research that we do is based on these shared socioeconomic pathways, which when I started being a sci-fi lover, I was so excited because these are essentially possible stories for the future. Will Europe become more green? Will we have more regional rivalry? And there's 6 scenarios that they use for all kinds of very complicated macroeconomic scenario building for the future. So I since then have become sort of disappointed in them because they don't sometimes dream big enough for me. But maybe other scenarios that are used for modeling or something similar.
Thanks. That's a great question. I'm gonna look up the pathways you mentioned. They sound really interesting. I'm aware of a sort of generic way of scenarios and sort of different proposed systems. What do I think about them?
Or no opinion is also okay.
Yeah, well, thought in process is what you're going to get. I think one of the things I find interesting about, there's any number of, we know what we need to do in a way, don't we? And we have the technologies, whether they be economic or technological or scientific or cultural. We know how to do it. In theory, we know what we need to do. It's all possible, and yet we don't do it. And so, I could give a more reflective answer, I think, but something about how fiction manages to bring those scenarios alive, those pathways, in a way that is, my tired brain is offering the word believable, but that's not quite what I mean. But I guess the nature of fiction, that it's affective and psychological and embodied and integrative as well, in that it can bring together multiple different pathways and scenarios and contingent factors that are not necessary, but nevertheless make it seem more livable. So yeah, I'll go in and think about that and look into those, and thank you for mentioning them. But I think there is something interesting about the nature of story, or the nature of fiction, and what it can do that this kind of pathways or modeling, or a sort of more programmatic kind of thinking perhaps doesn't do, or doesn't allow for.
Thank you. We're about at 3 o'clock now, so perhaps we should call the seminar to a close. There is tea and coffee outside for those who are here in person, so I think we could carry on discussions. But before then, please join me in thanking David. Do you have any notices at the end of the seminar? We don't. We don't. Just email.
Wow, thank you, David.
Thanks.
Amazing. All my questions are all like really
I'm currently feeling quite stupid, so you're the ones I wanted. Why did you type up?
no,
What's your favourite book?
to it.
Yeah, got a question.
I'll use up 10 minutes.
Thanks. How are you?
Basically what like very nice. People write books and then other people read the stories, and then I guess I'm wondering like how you talk about how do these stories in these books kind of filter through the collective
Yeah.
brain,
Yeah.
and like what are the timescales involved?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I'm thinking about, old question for us. I would think we teach the best masters. I can master them. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that Robinson finding his own solution for that, and that he's basically an activist as well. Or, his work.
I read Ministry for the